Welcome to the PGN Podcast. With this podcast, we're looking to normalize the conversation around flooding. What happens behind the scenes, lifting the curtains on the mystery that can sometimes come into play when you're either involved with flooding or trying to protect your home. We're talking to some experts in the industry and relaying some of the experiences we heard from some communities. Hopefully, after our series, you'll have a bit more information to help yourself or help others in an emergency where flooding is involved. Hello and welcome to the PGN Podcast. And today we'll be talking about the context behind flood management. What is the strategy? So we'll be looking at some of the nuances around the systems that we all have to follow when we look at flood management. We'll also be considering in detail the national strategy on flood and coastal erosion risk management in England. And we have a special guest who's going to take us through that today.
Yep. So firstly, I'm Carl and that was Meshi.
Hi.
Yeah. And our guest today, so like myself, he's a chartered engineer through FCERM, the Chartered Institute of Water and Environment Manager. But his day job title is the Flood and Coastal Risk Manager of Adaptation and Resilience for the Environment Agency. I like to call him the father of the FCRIP family. So I'd like to introduce Andrew Eden.
It's a worrying title, that, isn't it, Carl?
Yeah,
there's a lot of expectation that comes with the father of flood and coastal resilience. I wouldn't say that.
Right.
Yeah, so thanks for that introduction. I'm Andy, and as Carl says, I look after sort of broadly the themes of adaptation and resilience within the Environment Agency, specifically around flood and coastal risk management. And yeah, as Meshi sort of alluded to, I've had quite an interesting role in the development of the Environment Agency's position on adaptation and what we mean by flood and coastal resilience. Me and my team, as you might know, we manage the £200 million flood and coastal innovation programs. We'll come on to a bit of that later on, I guess. But we also have a role in really championing those messages of how do we create a nation that's resilient to flooding and coastal change, and where do we need to innovate in terms of developing more practical actions that can be used by different actors, I guess, in flood and coastal risk management.
Thank you for that introduction. And I think one of the key questions, to open this discussion is, what is FCERM? We all like talking in acronyms here, and what role does it play in our climate change in the future?
So, FCERM, we like to talk in acronyms, don't we? And sometimes the E gets lost. So we're basically talking about how do we manage the threats from flooding, coastal and erosion risks. So that's what FCERM is. The Environment Agency has a lead role in this, role defined by law in the Flood and Water Management Act, which sets us as an organisation that has a strategic overview for all matters of flood and coastal risk management. What that means is that we have a role in setting a national direction for how flood and coastal erosion risks in this country should be managed by everyone that has a stake in flood and coastal risk management. A lot of what we do as well is setting the direction for what we term risk management authorities, which is a term actually in the Flood and Water Management Act. So, the likes of the local flood authorities, local councils, water companies as well, internal drainage boards. There's a number of actors that have kind of responsibilities under the Flood and Water Management Act as risk management authorities. But yeah, the Environment Agency has a role in sort of setting that direction. And as you also know, the Environment Agency has a role in managing and delivering flood and coastal risk management interventions. So we have a £5.2 billion capital defence programme running over a 6-year period. And we also have many other responsibilities, our statutory consultee responsibility on development flood risk matters. We're also an environmental regulator. We're one of the largest environmental regulators in Europe, actually. So we have a number of, I think last count, 12,000 people working for us. So a number of responsibilities, both in environment and flood. But we're here today to talk about flood. So
yeah,
that's good.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things you've mentioned there is about capital investment, but also the Flood and Water Management Act and the rules of risk management authorities. And, one of the duties we have as risk management authorities there is to work with others. And how important do you find working with others in delivering that capital program?
I mean, I'll take that first question, which is how important is it to work with others? And I think it's crucial. And the complexity around the landscape of flood and coastal risk management in this country, it takes a career to fully understand it.
Absolutely.
And so then obviously the importance and how you get things done is by working in partnership. I would say that theme is intrinsic to the flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy. Previous iterations of the strategy have been quite focused on, delivery and focused on the roles of the Environment Agency. The 2020 strategy took a different approach. It deliberately brought in hundreds of stakeholders involved in flood and coastal risk management and involved them in the consultation and the development of what turned out to be the flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy. So there's almost like 3 levels, if you like, of the FCERM strategy. There's, how do we create sort of climate resilient places? There's a role of infrastructure that's resilient today and tomorrow. And then there's also the role of sort of working with others and working with people. So they're the 3 broad themes that kind of run through it. But I would say as well, the FCERM strategy sets out a vision for a nation that's resilient to 2100. And it does that through various strategic objectives and measures. And we have an action plan, which also puts the responsibility of delivery, not just on the Environment Agency, but on risk management authorities, water companies, and others that have a stake in flood and coastal risk management. I would also say that the FCERM strategy responds to the fact that climate is changing. In fact, in many instances, many things that we can look at, the climate is actually changing faster than we can adapt. So in that instance, it's even more crucial that we work together to try and get ahead of that.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that we can do that is through embracing a broader range of what we term flood and coastal resilience actions. And indeed, that's exactly what the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme is all about.
Let's dig deeper into the drivers. So you've touched on climate change. You've touched on the fact that we essentially need to accelerate how quickly we adapt and the ambitions of FCERM. So this current strategy was rolled out in 2020. So you've had a chance to kind of see what it's been able to achieve in that time. What are some of the wins so far for the strategy, and is how we kind of measuring its performance and how it's continued to adapt or how it's performing against the changing environment?
If I take the drivers first, because we spoke a bit about the context of the strategy, but practically speaking, yes, the climate is changing very fast. Mm-hmm. And part of the role of my team is also to set the national direction and steer guidance essentially on how risk management authorities should take account of climate change. Mm-hmm. So there's specific guidance we have on things like advising on peak rainfall intensity increases in river flow, increases in sea level, etc., and how that's integrated into decision making, so spatial planning, but also flood and coastal risk management schemes. Mm-hmm. So we deliberately took a decision to be quite precautionary with those allowances, given the uncertainties in climate science and given the uncertainties in what nations do to reduce emissions, and also the uncertainties in just the delivery and construction of things like defences and what developers do. So I think we've taken a very deliberate position there as the Environment Agency, because we need to keep our places resilient. The other thing to say is that when you start looking at the figures, if you ask any climate scientist, then they'll pretty much all agree that we're going to see a metre sea level rise above pre-industrial levels by 2100. And I think building to that level in our sort of coastal defences is definitely something that most people think is a good thing. Meshi, you asked the question about how do we measure the kind of performance of the strategy.
Yes.
So when the strategy was published, we also start to work on essentially a strategy action plan or roadmap. So the strategy roadmap is something that the Environment Agency kind of manages on and reports on, and it looks at all of the actions that we do that contribute towards the measures in the strategy. So, for example, we have measures on the delivery of the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme. There's also our Adaptation Pathways Programme. There's specific measures in the strategy, and we have different sort of ways of tracking progress, sort of completion of projects, looking at also how learning is embedded back into the organisation and of risk management authorities. And in essence, that's how we track it. But we have that for every single strategy measure. And we have people who are deliberately responsible, shall we say, and accountable for delivery of those strategy measures and actions within the Environment Agency and outside.
Yeah, and And Andrew, getting back to the RMAs, so lead local flood authorities, one of their responsibilities or duties is to have a flood risk management strategy. In the process of rewriting one myself, I think the national strategy that the EA have produced is really important in informing us. And how important is it that we all get those messages across and do it on a local level as well as a national level.
It's really important for the Environment Agency to position itself in the right way here. So yes, we have a strategic overview. Yes, we need to be kind of signalling the direction. But coming back to my original point, the FCERM strategy it's the ultimate result of all the consultation and collaboration that's happened before that point with the sector to understand what the sector needs. It's not the Environment Agency dictating; it's a reflection, if you like, of the sector. So it's meant to be, it's a joint, it's a collaborative endeavor, but the Environment Agency need to set it out. So it's good to hear, Carl, that the strategy sort of sets out the national picture. And I guess you can figure out how that then applies to your flood risk management strategy.
And obviously that national strategy, things like Schedule 3, water companies, drainage and wastewater management plans all impact, because the local flood risk management strategy is obviously dependent on those local challenges within each LLFA. But I think it's great to have that collaborative approach with a national organisation, with the EA, particularly when there is such a focus on planning and engagement and communities as part of that as well. Because I think that's as you said, 5-10 years ago we were just looking at delivery, infrastructure delivery, but now we've realised there's a lot more to flood management than drainage or flood risk schemes as well. So I think that naturally takes us to asking what the difference between a traditional flood alleviation scheme is and things like nature-based solutions and then flood resilience as well.
So we can't build our way out of climate change. It's probably the sort of starting message there. And I think traditionally flood and coastal risk management has been an engineering-led discipline. You can understand why. We have a big flood event like the likes of 1953, and there's a big national response. End up with embankments all the way down the East Coast. And that's proved us very well. And indeed, we know a lot about the successes and the performance of hard structures like embankments, defences, walls. And I think the one thing that the FCERM strategy is very clear on is that there will always be a place for conventional defences. They remain super important for everything that we do. But with the climate changing faster than we can adapt, we have to really think broadly about alternative measures to be able to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. Because the sad reality is that some places we won't be able to afford to build defences, and we will have to explore other measures to be able to manage that risk. So that message comes across in the flood and coastal risk management strategy, very clear. Climate's changing, we need to consider other things. So through the FCERM strategy, we came up with this way of explaining what we term flood and coastal resilience. And, to be honest, you can cut the term resilience in a myriad of different ways, and it means different things to lots of different people. So we did a lot of consultation to understand, well, how do we explain this in the context of flood and coastal risk management? And we define flood and coastal resilience as the capacity of people and places to better plan, protect, respond, and recover from flooding and coastal change. And those aspects of protection, response, and recovery and planning are consistent with a lot of explanations and descriptions of resilience in any context.
And I think it's important they use the term protect as opposed to prevent. As well, because we never know how much rain's going to fall, or as you said, sea meter rises. That's all prediction, but there's no hard evidence.
I think just following on what you're describing there, Andy, we're going into uncharted waters, should we say? So there's a lot of change coming, and we know it's coming, but the quantification of that change is what's unknown to an extent. So adaptability, flexibility, the ability to change with a changing environment has gone up the agenda. And in your description of what FCERM, the strategy, its ambition, the change from what's happened before, it's clear that's one of the main focuses, the kind of climate change driver there, the importance of why we need to work in a different way, more collaboration, more other opportunities. We still need the engineering, but we need other things to support the engineering essentially. And I guess my question is around, because you've touched on some programs there, it's around some of the enabling, should we say, programs that the Environment Agency is creating spaces where innovation can happen to help us and an industry tackle some of these challenges. Because you've mentioned FCRIP and you mentioned, I think you mentioned other pathways as well. So just talk to us about what some of these programs are.
So the strategy sets a direction. It sets out a vision for what we want to try and achieve. But to try and achieve that, we need to do different things, as you sort of pointed to. One of the principal ways that the Environment Agency are doing this is through the £200 million flooding coastal innovation programs, which my team manage. So in essence, we were successful in securing that money from DEFRA and HM Treasury, making the case that actually we need to try different things in different places to meet a changing climate, but also embrace a different range of resilience actions. So that set of programs is basically split out into 3 separate programs. There's the £150 million flooding coastal resilience innovation program, which Project Groundwater Northumbria are part of. And what that is trying to do is, in 25 local places across the country, try different flooding coastal resilience actions, whether that's nature-based solutions, the use of property flood resilience, sort of co-development and creation of sustainable drainage systems, the use of artificial intelligence in flood warning, and also maintenance and monitoring of assets, and then also the use of other funding mechanisms, innovative finance mechanisms to fund flooding coastal resilience. I think one of those projects is actually Tees Tidelands in this particular patch, where they're looking at sort of creating a habitat banking system to fund flood resilience. There's also our £8 million Adaptation Pathways program. And what that's trying to do in four different locations, 5 different projects across the country, is to build on something called the Adaptation Pathway approach, which has been sort of championed by our colleagues down in Thames Estuary, part of the Thames Estuary 2100 plan. And essentially, it's trying to deal with some of the things that you mentioned, Meshi, about trying to keep pace with climate change and predict what climate change could mean for sea level rise and then the impacts within London and the wider Thames Estuary, and trying to sequence the investment in flooding coastal risk management in that locality, primarily focused on things like the construction of a new barrier or potential enhancement of the barrier that we already have, upgraded defences, also stronger development planning policies, the role of riparian landowners. So it's really doing a lot down there. So what we're trying to do in other geographies like the Humber, River Severn, 2 projects in Yorkshire, is developing long-term plans for adaptation for how we might be able to track when certain climate triggers and thresholds are reached, and when we might take action. And we're developing that in partnership with local authorities and other local partners. The intent is that learning can then be fed back into the business and also available to risk management authorities. And then we have something else called the £36 million Coastal Transition Accelerator Programme. And that's now got 5 projects. I think it's East Riding, North Norfolk, and 2 projects in Dorset and 1 in Cornwall. And what they're trying to do is to really understand how do we transition and adapt to a changing coastline from coastal erosion. So places like East Riding and North Norfolk have got some of the most fastest eroding coastlines in the country. I think 84% of all the properties that are going to fall into the sea in the next 20 years or at risk of falling into the sea are located in those locations. And similarly, Dorset and Cornwall have a high proportion of residential and commercial premises that are at risk. So what we're trying to do there is understand, well, how do we manage that, and how do we create the conditions and incentives and mechanisms to be able to help communities and places transition away from an eroding coast. But all those things taken together, though just in that £200 million bucket that I explained, all that learning has been captured and collated by my team. And we're thinking about ways where that can be embedded either into guidance or practice or shared with the wider flooding coastal risk management community. But certainly the likes of the FCRIP projects, the 25 locations, also have a role in making sure that you guys champion all the learning that you're doing.
Yeah.
So it's not just all on the Environment Agency. It's very much we want to see what the projects can do individually to share the learning that they're doing.
But would you say though that I guess the Environment Agency is enabling LLFAs and other authorities with a stake in flood management to go further? Because we've touched on the fact that we have business cases and systems in place, existing systems in place, which encourage a certain type of working. And I feel that actually with this innovation funds or kind of standalone programs, it does encourage that kind of out-of-box thinking. If money was no issue, what could you do? And obviously there's always the cap to how much money is available, but the opportunity to kind of not worry about the funding side of it and go, right, okay, we can do something really special here.
Yeah. With any money that you get given, you've got to define the parameters, right? And we were very clear with the £200 million innovation fund that we would have separate decisions, if you like, on how we treat things like benefits and the eligibility, essentially. So things like partnership funding policy does not apply to the 200 million. Things like outcome measures don't apply to the 200 million. But we use a different framework for establishing value at risk, value potential, and then also critically valuing the learning benefits that come out of the projects themselves, because that has a massive value. That's the whole point of doing it, right?
And it's sharing that learning as well, because again, through the Northumbrian Integrated Drainage Partnership, we meet once a quarter, all local authorities in the region with Northumbrian Water and Environment Agency. As part of that agenda, we always have a discussion on the different FCRIP projects within the region, and it's really interesting to see. But also that partnership allows us to communicate better, not only with people in the Environment Agency who are involved in these projects, but people at those local authorities. And I think that's key, that we are sharing that information as an industry as well.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I would say is that Meshi, you're probably going to laugh as I said this before, but when you give local authorities the space to innovate, they thrive. So that's what the innovation programs do, and that's been really, really clear. Meshi, you're also picking up on something else earlier around not just the some of the issues around funding, essentially. So just the nature of doing the £200 million innovation programs. We're getting learning around where the barriers might be in the process. So things like, our grant and aid memorandum, which allows us to move money over to risk management authorities. Actually, can improvements be made there? To think about, how do we get money over in a different way, or is there scope to think about other actors? But there are sort of complexities and mechanisms actually just within government policy, which sort of very rightly prevent us from, distributing money to bodies and organizations which may not have, the right sort of financial controls in place, because we have a duty to manage public money well.
Yeah.
And I think that's a tension there between, we need to involve as many actors as possible, but we also need to manage public money well, and that tension will always be there. But the role of things like, risk management authorities, lead local flood authorities, providing that kind of hook, if you like, for partners, is one of the ways that we can bring more people in. Yeah. So certainly the models that you guys have with the FCRIP projects is a good model, because you control that partnership with any lead local flood authority, but then you also can meet the requirements that we need to make sure we're managing public money well.
It's about checks and balances, essentially.
It is. It's all the boring stuff.
But that's a good lead, though, because I think Carl touched on traditional and nature-based solutions, but we're going to kind of take a look at nature-based solutions only because of the recently promoted new round on NFM program by the Environment Agency. Just take us through. Obviously, it's a second part to this. There was a pilot a few years ago, and this time round, the program has opened up to more stakeholders, going back to your point about getting the stakeholders involved in flood management involved in the process of innovation and actually pushing forward the strategy as well. So tell us more about the NFM program.
Intuitively, we know nature-based solutions are a good thing, both for amenity, habitat, mitigating the worst of climate change, and through some of the work that the previous natural flood management program did, which was more around kind of research and just learning, we know that it can have benefits in terms of flood risk as well. I think what that first natural flood management program showed, and there's a Working with Natural Processes directory which also supports that, has shown that delivered in the right way, it can deliver flood risk benefits, whether that's the use of woody debris, storage, reconnection of wetlands, etc., or planting trees. So what the most recent sort of program that you mentioned, Meshi, which is a £25 million natural flood management program, that's inviting expressions of interest from essentially a range of different partners, inviting partners from ENGOs or risk management authorities or landowners, farmers, etc., to essentially come in and bid for funding for small or large projects in different locations across the country to deliver natural flood management. We are still learning, I guess, through that process, but we've already been able to construct sort of a very sort of solid natural flood management economic model, which allows us to work out the potential benefits, if you like, both flood risk and environment, from some of these natural flood management schemes. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think we still need to learn by doing. And even with these natural flood management projects, there's a commitment to contribute to ongoing monitoring and extraction of that learning to improve the evidence base. And what we hope to see is that model and that sort of opening out, if you like, of natural flood management becomes available to more partners in the future. But I still think there's still some learning to gain from the natural flood management program. But Meshi, natural flood management is also a fantastic way of involving a local community. Some of the learning from the previous natural flood management program was that sort of community groups and charities, essentially organizations like wildlife trusts, etc., are very well placed to deliver natural flood management. But there are still some blockers and trains. So, securing landowner agreements, for example, to host these kind of things is very challenging. There's questions around, who maintains these assets, because they are assets. Going forward. And there's also questions around sort of ongoing funding for maintenance. And I know that there's ongoing conversations around its relationship with things like environmental land management scheme.
Yeah. And I think the natural flow management, it's that wider benefit, that carbon capture, or, there's environmental benefit. And I think, thinking back to 2015, when the planning process changed and sustainable drainage was introduced in new developments, SUDS or sustainable drainage wasn't anything new. Just in the past, that, as a design engineer, you would go to Northumbrian Water, you would get a discharge rate, you would work out how much water is coming off the site, and you'd build an underground tank to manage that. But what's been to hold it. But when these new regulations came in, we started seeing ponds and basins and features on the surface. And, I think that removes that out of sight, out of mind. And as you're saying, these are assets. These need to be maintained. These need to be managed. But a key part of this, and that's coming back to the FCERM strategy, is about the engagement and understanding of everyday people and understanding the value that those assets you see are or have to that community as well. And I think that's a really important point.
But building on that, though, is recognizing that a lot of these assets are multifunctional and they bring real value to communities. They have eco benefits, they have biodiversity benefits, they have amenity benefits. And actually, it's in this strategy, and I think the strategy is very comprehensive. It has a clear goal, it has a clear ambition. You've talked about partnership between risk management authorities, kind of a coordinated, intentional innovation to this combined challenge. I guess for me, the question is, how are we taking our communities along in this journey? How involved are they in the kind of learning, in the kind of knowledge sharing? How do we get them empowered to be part of the solution?
I think that's a big question. I would say that yes, the strategy makes a commitment towards better integration of communities and better engagement with communities. I think it might be better to maybe pick out some of the examples where it's working really well. So if there's this kind of concept which we have on the Stronger Shores project, I believe, which is this concept of engagement base flow. Which is essentially the more engagement that you do, it makes, and if you maintain that engagement with community and maintain that involvement over time, you can, when new projects and opportunities come on board, it's easier to actually get implementation and involvement in that project. I would just say across FCRIP, full stop, the focus on community engagement is paramount across all the 25 projects. And you'll be aware as well that one of the things that we have done is, we've looked at project readiness essentially across all of the projects, which looks at not just deliverability, but the status of your stakeholders and partners. how do you know they're actually wedded to the process here? How are they involved? Are they supportive? Is there any sort of political or stakeholder objection? All these sorts of questions have been asked at other projects even before business case. And what's interesting is that kind of concept of readiness that came out of FGRIP has already, we've already produced guidance, already been used within the Environment Agency on projects. So that's a direct sort of learning output. I think the other thing is, how do you give, Meshi, you said, how do you give communities a bigger voice? So some of the projects like, is it the Durham project we have?
Suds Plus.
Suds Plus. So their Suds Plus approach is all around the co-creation and co-design of sustainable drainage systems with the community, and then looking forward to the sort of ongoing maintenance and adoption of those assets by the community. And that's a really interesting approach. It sort of removes that reliance, if you like, on local authorities and other organizations to maintain. I really hope it's going to be successful, because if you can create the conditions where the community are actually taking ownership and accountability for their own management, in that case of surface water, and that's a fantastic outcome. And they've also had a stake in the design process for those things. So another example of where the communities are actually actively involved. I think the other thing I'd say is, and this is something that's been delivered through our Adaptation Pathways program, in many of the projects, we have actually experimented with the use of these things, community panels, sometimes called citizens' juries, which is essentially trying to find ways of giving communities a greater voice in decision making. So that's the choice of options, trying to find out what their kind of vision and objectives are for their place, and that's been very successful so far. It's still going on, but the learning so far has shown sort of the benefits that you can have by involving them in the decision making process early. I think there are some learning points already, like with some local authorities, there is a reluctance to have too much community involvement in that governance and that decision making process. So I think there's actually the barrier there is cultural and risk appetite.
Yeah. So I'm going to reflect to kind of my previous career, as it were, in traffic and highways and transport. And I think public consultation, it was a statutory function of one of, we as part of a legal order process, you would have to undertake a public consultation. And what you actually found was the person or the voices that were the loudest did not necessarily represent the wider community. And I think that's a really key part of that engagement. And you need to make sure that your engagement is sensitive to each community and each demographic of that community. Do you see that in the different projects? Do you see the engagement tailored to the projects?
I think what I would say is that engagement is a very important skill, and I think a lot of engineers sometimes just see it as consultation and comms. And I think that's a legacy. I think that's a cultural issue as well. But I do see, it is changing. So Meshi, you were talking about Anusha Shah, the new sort of president of ICE, who sort of made it front and center to actually tackle this particular problem. But I would also say that the Environment Agency, we've not been blind to that. I would also say that all of our schemes, or the amount of engagement that we do at a local level, it's all focused on putting communities and stakeholders first. So we talk previously around a decide, announce, defend model. So we decide, we do the analysis, we decide what defense is suitable, and then we say we're going to do it, and then we defend it with the community. Well, that used to be the model, and that hasn't been the model for a long time. So we now have an ED model, which is engage, deliberate, decide. But that is deliberately sort of find out what the stakeholders and communities want, co-develop it, make sure it meets their needs, and then decide collectively on what the right way forward is. And that means the solution is going to be more, accepted.
Yeah. So again, we started adapting that educate, decide, and do approach. I know the acronym, but I never. I always thought it was design and defend, not design, announce, and defend. Yeah. So there you go. You know what the acronyms generally mean, but not necessarily.
I have to as the Environment Agency. We love acronyms.
Yeah,
I think we all love acronyms. So on the conversation around that, though, so I think the kind of engaging up front is an obvious approach. Engage get everyone on board, get your partners together, including the community. And actually, if you have more champions, you're more likely to succeed. The challenge sometimes is when, like you said, you've got cultures, you've got embedded systems, and that resistance kicks in. So you want to go out, for example, very simply, you want to go out and speak to a community or share and go, no, we don't know what we're going to do yet. Or you don't want to share too much information because there's uncertainty or it might upset. And it might upset, that's the bit, it's the fear of the one.
Yeah.
Somehow outweighs the benefit to the 100, that loudest voice. And I guess one of the kind of the action towards that is having a plan where you're like, right, okay, how do we reduce the risk? Mm-hmm. But human nature is sometimes fear can have an overriding influence on decisions we make. And then that could also have an impact on the potential for extremely good work. Given your experience, given your access to some of these really incredible programs, what kind of advice do you have for us on that?
In terms of trying to change human nature?
Trying to manage and conflict management. Trying to get that type of personality on board. So get them to see, not get them to see. Yeah, the skeptic.
Yeah,
get the skeptic.
And I think the skeptic almost stands in the way of innovation.
Yes.
So how do we get around that?
It's a journey. Approach? So if you had to write a roadmap for us, what would that look like?
Hey, I think there's no special learning coming out of FCRIP on that. Mm-hmm. This is just around managing people, essentially, and influencing and engaging. I think it's really important to understand right from the very beginning, what do your stakeholders want? But then also tiering stakeholders as well. You need to think about your project governance, your partnership governance, etc. Where does that individual, where does that organization sit in the structure? Mm-hmm. And are they influential? Are they a blocker? And also understanding what their drivers and objectives are from the very beginning, so you can then work out: is there a pathway here? Is there a solution, or is there a fundamental blocker, which means that this cannot happen? Mm-hmm. And that's not going to change. Mm-hmm. The example I might give is, maybe a partnership that's working together to manage sea level rise in their place. Maybe there's multiple MP constituencies, and it's very difficult for an MP to essentially agree to a situation where they might be losing part of their constituency to sea level rise to benefit others. And fundamentally, that's a really, really hard sell. Mm-hmm. And then you might need to think about, well, what other sort of stronger leadership do you need around that, above it, to make sure that can happen? But fundamentally, it's just, what do your partners want? What do your stakeholders want? Can we achieve those aspirations together? If not, then sometimes you have to sort of think about who you want in that partnership going forward to make it a reality.
Yeah.
And then also, how can you use the collective voice of those that do support it to change opinions and influence? I would also say that sometimes, organizations like the Environment Agency, local authorities, consultants, we're not the right organization to often have that conversation. Might not be the right individual. So also thinking, where does the power lie in that relationship and that dynamic, whether it's with organizations or we need to bring someone else in. And it's not, I would say it's not a written down process.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's I would find it difficult to write that down as an approach. I think it's very much around experiencing and influencing, which helps you kind of overcome those barriers. And I would also say that sometimes as engineers, we think we can solve solutions and bring people on board by just generating more data. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't get you any way further forward. Yeah. Certainty does not change people's perception necessarily.
Yeah.
And I think a good example of that is, talking about nature-based solutions and sort of green-blue infrastructure, where you'd have that in city centres. And one of the key sort of stoppers for that is assurance on maintenance. And obviously you need to engage with the people who would maintain it. And there are examples now elsewhere in the country where they are being maintained successfully, and it's sort of introducing and using examples, which I feel has been a good way to stopping some of that skepticism. But again, that's all been through information sharing through the Environment Agency, and kind of us as local authorities talking to each other.
Well, I think sometimes though it's about the problem. So NFM is a really good example where we recognize the value of NFM. We can signpost someone to get funding to design and implement a natural flood management project. Tick, tick, tick. And then we get to how do you take care of it? And in the communication around that, you can kind of look at this, well, it is a problem, but how about an opportunity? How about an opportunity where as part of the design and development, we essentially teach you how to live with NFM. So you provide them the skills to manage the asset as opposed to, oh, we don't currently have funding for maintenance. And I think if you look at the problem that this particular stakeholder is putting to you, because that's the core of their objection. I don't want to do it because I don't want the responsibility. But actually what that means is I don't know what to do with this. Why should I take it on? So if you break it down into little bite sizes, like why don't you want it? Oh, you're scared about being responsible. You're scared about the cost. You're scared about this. Let's look at what that is. We can train you. We can do this, or, you know what I mean? So you then don't feel like you have this massive weight on your shoulders. Life is already complicated enough. You don't need any more responsibility, that kind of thing.
He's talking about removing the fear, but also selling, not necessarily selling the benefits, but helping them realize what the benefits are to them.
Yeah, it's not impossible. Yeah. Because there are people that will see one thing and the whole thing doesn't make sense because it's a big issue. And actually, if you can go through the journey where they see that it's not a big issue because they have a support network, because they know how to live with the whatever asset it is. And we had this experience when I was kind of delivering property flood resilience in Northumbrian Water, where we went to see customers and we were going to pay for the PFR, we're going to install it, we're going to do everything. And they're like, yes, but I don't know what this is. It sounds good, but when you walk away, I'm still going to have to live with it. And it was in two folds. The first bit was, all right, we'll maintain it for a period so you know what maintaining looks like. So there's kind of a handover, not just a cold off the cliff kind of approach. The second bit was like a handover package, which we do for projects. So there you go. That's the support package. It tells you who to call. You have the warranties in there. You've got all the British Standard kite mark information, which you can pass on to your insurance companies. Make sure you check flood doors. Make sure you keep an eye on those seals, because if the seal twists, this is what happens. And then you have somebody who's like, okay, I know what this is. It's my asset, but I have everything I need in my back pocket to live with it. And that changes the conversation completely.
Flood Mary, who often sort of talks about
I've met her before, yes.
Resilience.
Yeah. I've met her before, yes.
She speaks about the making things practical, making advice practical to householders. And, you know, what does it mean for your house? When do you need to kind of do this, put this intervention in place? When do you need to check seals, install things? And I think some of the observations she sees sometimes is the proliferation of information to householders and these sorts of things. So her big challenge is trying to just simplify things for householders and make it, as you say, remove the fear. And you can remove the fear by just being simple and understanding of their needs and how they need to put things in play.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that with SODS as well, because it's a while ago now, because SODS are a lot more mainstream. But a capital investment project I was doing, again, with Northumbrian Water, and part of it was a combination of grey systems, but also we had large-scale basins, but we had some schools in the estate, so we had some ponds and basins in schools as well. And when the idea was first kind of floated by the schools, they were like, whoa, we have children here.
Yeah.
You're going to create a hazard.
And they had to put fences around it. And
yeah. But the first thing was the journey. We started from basics, but then we worked through the basics. And then when we got to the residual issues, we go, right, okay, this is what we can do, right? So it's still a learning opportunity. You can educate your kids around biodiversity and all this kind of stuff. And we can make it safe for you. And we all get what we want. And that whole journey just, for me, it showed that sometimes, I mean, yes, we do have people that are just skeptics, by the way. There's always going to be the person that's just like, I don't care. But for most people, it's underpinned by a genuine concern, a genuine fear. And there's two faults to that. Some of them may be aware enough to articulate what that fear is. And others may just be like, this is far too complicated. It's far too new. I like my space safe and secure. And it's unpicking that and getting to the root and then actually working with them to address those concerns. And the other thing is once you do that, there's a trust factor as well. Because you build that trust. They know they can trust where you're coming from, which can then support further work. And you're right, I think more often than not, we look at the bigger picture, which is great. We look at the ambition, which is great. But we sometimes forget about the person who is going to affect the most.
Yeah.
And the person who might actually disengage because they feel like we're not seeing them or not listening to them, and therefore we don't care about them. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, building on what Meshi said there, I personally see when we've got flood resilience, there's two different issues here with regard to buy-in, and what you've got to think is the mental health perspective from people who have experienced flooding. And I've had personal experience with residents where they've flooded in the past, and they've seen the weather forecast, they've had to take half days of work to come home, and they're very, very anxious. They've got sandbags there, and PFR is a great opportunity to remove that anxiety. But also as well, when you're looking at longer term solutions and retrofit SUD schemes and flood defence grant and aid schemes, sometimes where you need to put the solution is not necessarily where the problem is. And I think getting people to buy into those solutions when it's not visibly in front of them, but also as well, if you're putting a basin in front of people that have never flooded, they say, well, why do we have to put up with this? Why is it, and how do we change that mindset?
Yeah, not my problem.
Yeah. I think maybe it starts with, comes back to what we discussed before around how do you bring the community along with this, and thinking about what the right actors are within the community to bring that together. Because that sort of example you gave, Carl, of, they want to see a solution right in front of them, but actually, could we solve this problem by putting storage upstream in the catchment or whatever it might be, managing water in a different way? That feels abstract to them. They can't see it. And you can't necessarily start talking about that in a way which is going to connect with them if they don't have the technical understanding, or it's just, that's perfectly fine. So how do you get communities on board? Well, who or what organization is the sort of glue, if you like, that holds that community together? So the use of community leaders, use of things like community notice boards, events, etc., where the Environment Agency or lead local flood authority aren't leading that discussion, is really crucial. And organizations like the National Flood Forum do this really, really well, where they work in partnership with the lead local flood authority or other organizations. They come into a community and they build that relationship up. They build that trust, if you like, with the community to understand their needs, and then jointly, collaboratively develop those solutions or get them more familiar with, upstream storage or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And
it's that thing.
And I think, having done that, representing local authorities in the past, trying to get the public on board, some naturally have resentment towards and distrust towards the council, even if it's not the department I'm representing. And I feel that when we go out, we obviously within this region, we have community engagement officers. What I find is when we go out as a partnership, and Northumbrian Water is sometimes part of our partnership as well, the fact that partnership's already formed, it can't be, it's them, or it's, because we're all there together and we're all out there wanting to make that change.
Could we be more ambitious? And I'll tell you why. So, Carl, you've touched on distrust, and I had the honor, I would say honor, because it was in the most distressing time. I had people welcome me into their homes and tell me about their experience on the back of Thunder Thursday 2012 in the Northeast. And a lot of it was in that moment, people were scared. They were emotionally just drained. They'd been through an unimaginable experience. I lived in the Northeast, and the extent of my experience was I was stuck in my car for 5 hours because I was stuck in traffic. But for others, their entire livelihoods was just blown out of water. And the distrust thing came up a few times, more than a few times, is around the fact that, oh, but this is not the first time, this is the biggest one, but it's not the first time, it's always been happening. And I think everything we've described there is good. But what usually happens is we identify an issue. And even when we work with communities from as early as possible, we identify the issue and then we go out and talk to communities. And then we can build a bigger business case, a project around them. We live in a society when it's not flooding, it falls off the agenda. And it only comes back on the agenda when there's a problem, which then makes it already a problem and therefore the distrust. Whereas if we can normalize the conversation and it's as easy as every day. So you have a general awareness of what that looks like. You have a general awareness of what to do in an event of. So you have a plan that is conscious of your day-to-day life. It's just as conscious as getting up and having a cup of tea or whatever, or as conscious as your house insurance or your TV license. Like those are things that most people, you just know to do because it's part of the fabric of our day-to-day life. Then it makes it easier, or then you have a good foundation to then have these forums to build on when you have particular projects or particular community events to kind of engage with. And I think it's the point that we kind of, when we talk about the different areas of flooding, when someone calls, for example, and says, I have flooding, and we're like, well, what type of flooding is? Or to speak to this person, you can see why there's a distrust. Because they're like, what do you mean? Or if I called the flood line and said, oh, my sewer flooded, well, you can't tell us. What do you mean I can't tell you? You're the flood line. And it's how aware are we as a community outside the space we're in of what the system actually is? Because you only tap into that system. Most people only tap into the system when they flood, or if you're repeat flooded, so you're in the system continuously because you're always afraid every time it rains, something's going to happen. Neither's a healthy place to enter a conversation, is it?
No. I think tapping into a few things there. I think the first thing I'd say is flooding isn't the most important thing to most people. And of course, it will fall off the agenda to other daily injects and stresses and other things that matter. But even within the kind of context of hazards more generally, there's other hazards to consider that maybe local authorities, environment agency, other organizations have a duty to be involved with. And it comes back to the other point I made. It's how do we solve the challenges and connections within communities? How do you build social resilience, essentially? And that's not necessarily a flood thing. That's everything.
Yeah.
So how do you build those connections at a community level to build social resilience so communities are more connected? You improve understanding generally. You improve their ability to respond. You improve their autonomy and their ability to make decisions. And I'm not talking about flooding here. I'm just talking generally about sort of tackling that. And if you have that network and that understanding and that competence and that trust, injecting things like, let's develop a flood plan, let's work out how we're going to respond in an instant, is that much easier.
Yeah.
So I think sort of taking it a level above flooding is probably an interesting avenue to explore. And I would also say that, yourselves as local authorities are quite well placed to have that conversation, given the breadth of themes and topics and responsibilities you have.
Again, Innovation Festival earlier this year, Project Groundwater in Northumbria got the chance to run a sprint, and we came away with some really interesting ideas. But one of them is around what you said, and it was around, as a council, the ability to create spaces where you can essentially support and share information, which will essentially enable things like community action groups. But exactly what you're talking about, where you can link up resources, you can enable things like flood action plans. And the conversation actually went a step further than that. It's how do you fund that? So there was if there was something in place from a legislative perspective, it would come through the council. The council could connect with other authorities. So there's the kind of connecting point between the different parties. It also meant that information through a single point meant it was up to date, it was current, and we all should be paying our council tax. So there's kind of a singular point where you would naturally go back to somebody who could link you to where you needed to be. And that's something that we are looking at as part of the project. But that's the point about being more ambitious about some of the plans we make. And also a good point that Andy about standing back a little bit and looking at the bigger picture, really. Because in one sense, we're talking about flooding across the board, and there's different types of flooding. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the bigger picture is about the communities. And if you talk about community resilience and community empowerment, then actually instead of having 10 different things for them to worry about, there's just a single nucleus, and those systems all feed into it.
There's a concept, a bit of an anecdote, but when you start looking at the comparisons between wealthy nations and less wealthy nations, in wealthy nations, there's a heavy reliance on the state to intervene, construct, engineering defenses, everything else. And what that means is you create the condition of high infrastructure resilience. Mm-hmm. If you go to other countries around the world, they don't necessarily have the same sort of taxation systems. They don't necessarily have the same wealth. So what do you find? You find essentially you have higher levels of social resilience because people have to do it. Mm-hmm. And we have this sort of weird situation where, in wealthy nations, we essentially have high levels of infrastructural resilience, low levels of social resilience. And then we have the flip side of that in other nations. So there is something around what can be done in that sort of space to build social resilience. And to be fair, that's what the FCERM strategy was sort of starting to get into, mm-hmm. with making sure people are better plan and prepared and able to recover quickly from flooding and coastal change. It sort of recognizes the importance of protection and infrastructure resilience essentially, but then also what more can we do to make sure that people have a higher level of social resilience?
I think you've answered my final question, because it's been really good. And what we do is we close every episode with a bit of we call it a crystal ball moment. And the idea is, if you could change or overhaul or just disrupt one thing to completely transform, consider the FCERM next edition of the strategy. What would this big thing that we could do to take it to the next level?
That's a really good question, and I'm going to struggle to think of that. But hey, I mean, I think what I'd like to see is this transition, if you like, to an acceptance that we have to be more okay, I guess, with uncertainty, and that's a big issue, both whether you're sort of working engineering, wherever you work in the flood risk sector or working with communities, because we cannot predict with absolute certainty when and what the impacts of climate change are going to be. So this idea of adaptive planning and planning for a range of scenarios and making that the norm, essentially, that's the change that I want to see going forward. And it's actually not a hard concept, right? We don't hedging your bets, mm-hmm. planning for a range. It could be this, it could be that. The concept is not hard for people to understand, but for some reason we make it complicated by trying to fit a simple concept into our existing structures. So I'd like, in terms of change, I want to see that simple concept embedded in everything we do.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's been great talking to you today. I think we've come away with lots of ideas, and I've got lots of notes as well. Yeah. So it's been really inspiring talking to you today.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Andy. Pleasure as always. Cheers.
Thank you for having me. It's great to have Project Groundwater Northumbria as part of our programme. And looking forward to talking with you again.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for listening to the PGN podcast today. We hope you found it informative and enjoyable. If you did, please like and subscribe to the podcast. But also, please, if you find this useful to anyone else, pass it on and spread the word.
To find out more about Project Groundwater Northumbria, please visit www.pgn.org.uk.